Why were archaeologists shocked when they zoomed in on this family portrait from 1903? Dr. Emily Chen adjusted the high-resolution scanner for what felt like the 100th time that week, her eyes tired from examining faded photographs in the dim lighting of the Historical Archives Center in Boston, Massachusetts. It was late October 2023, and she had been working on a project to digitize photographs from early 20th century New England families, hoping to preserve these fragile images before time rendered them completely unreadable. Most of the photographs were predictable. Stern-faced families in their Sunday best, children posed rigidly beside their parents, couples standing formally in front of painted backdrops. The early 1900s had been a time when photography was still relatively expensive, and families treated portrait sessions with the utmost seriousness. Smiles were rare. Casual poses were non-existent. Every photograph was a formal document of existence, a proof that these people had lived and wanted to be remembered. But this particular photograph was different in a way Emily couldn't immediately articulate. The image showed a family of 3 in what appeared to be a well-appointed living room. The father stood on the left, a man in his early 30s with dark hair and a thick mustache, wearing a 3-piece suit with a watch chain visible across his vest. The mother sat in an upholstered chair, a woman perhaps in her late 20s, wearing a high-necked white blouse with delicate lace and a long, dark skirt. Her hair was pulled back in the Gibson girl style popular at the turn of the century, and her hands were folded carefully in her lap. But it was the baby that drew Emily's attention. The infant, perhaps 6 or 8 months old, sat on the mother's lap, wearing a long white christening gown that cascaded over the mother's knees. The baby's face was turned slightly toward the camera, and unlike most infant photographs from this era, where babies were often blurred from movement or crying, this child appeared remarkably calm and still. Emily noticed something else too. While the parents' expressions were typically serious for the period, there was something in their eyes, a wariness perhaps, or a protective tension, that seemed unusual. The father's hand rested on the back of the mother's chair, but his posture seemed rigid, almost defensive. The mother's arms encircled the baby with what looked like more than the usual maternal protectiveness. The photograph had come from an estate sale in Salem, part of a collection belonging to a family named Morrison. According to the documentation, the photo was dated March 1903 and had been taken in the family's home rather than in a professional studio. This was unusual for the time. Home photography required expensive equipment and considerable skill. Emily carefully placed the photograph on the scanner bed and initiated the high-resolution scan. The machine hummed to life, its light bar moving slowly across the image, capturing every microscopic detail. As she waited, she made notes about the photograph's condition, the visible details, and the historical context. She had no idea that what the scanner was about to reveal would consume the next 6 months of her life and uncover a story of love, sacrifice, and courage that had been hidden in plain sight for over a century. The scanning process took nearly 30 minutes. Emily made herself tea in the small kitchenette down the hall, the familiar ritual helping her stay alert after hours of detailed work. When she returned to her desk, the digital image was fully loaded on her screen, rendered in extraordinary detail that revealed textures and nuances invisible to the naked eye. She began her systematic examination, zooming in on different sections of the photograph. The wallpaper pattern became clear, an intricate floral design popular in the early 1900s. The furniture showed quality craftsmanship, suggesting a family of comfortable means. A bookshelf in the background held leather-bound volumes, and she could make out some of the titles, works of literature and reference books that indicated education and culture. Emily zoomed in on the parents' faces. The father had light-colored eyes, possibly blue or gray, and his expression was controlled and serious. There was a small scar on his chin, barely visible. The mother had darker eyes and delicate features. Her wedding ring was visible on her left hand, and she wore a small brooch at her collar. Then Emily turned her attention to the baby, zooming in on the infant's face and upper body. The christening gown was elaborate, with intricate embroidery and lace work that would have been expensive and time-consuming to create. The baby's face was cherubic, with round cheeks and wide eyes that stared toward the camera with infant curiosity. But as Emily increased the magnification, she noticed something that made her pause. The baby's left hand was visible, extending slightly from beneath the gown's long sleeve. The positioning seemed deliberate, as if the mother had carefully arranged the fabric to cover most of the arm, while still allowing the hand to show. Emily zoomed in further on the exposed skin of the baby's wrist and lower arm. At first, she thought she was seeing shadows or artifacts from the photographic process. But as she adjusted the contrast and brightness, the details became unmistakable. There were marks on the baby's skin, not the typical baby wrinkles or natural skin variations, but distinct discolorations. Patches of lighter and darker skin that formed irregular patterns along the visible portion of the arm. The marks had the appearance of healed burn scars, the kind that would result from exposure to fire or extreme heat. Emily sat back, her tea forgotten and growing cold. She had examined thousands of historical photographs, including many that showed evidence of injuries, illnesses, and the hardships of early 20th century life. But something about these marks on an infant troubled her deeply. The positioning of the gown, the way it seemed carefully arranged to conceal most of the baby's arms and body, suggested the parents were aware of the scarring and trying to minimize its visibility. She zoomed in on other parts of the baby visible in the photograph. The right hand, partially visible near the mother's arm, showed similar discoloration. A small section of the baby's neck, just visible above the gown's high collar, also appeared to have irregular pigmentation. Emily began taking screenshots, saving the magnified images in a dedicated folder. She made detailed notes about the location and pattern of the marks, documenting everything she observed. Her historian's mind was already racing with questions. Emily spent the next hour examining every detail of the photograph, but her attention kept returning to those marks on the baby's skin. She had seen burn scars before in historical medical photographs and documentation from industrial accidents, house fires, and other tragedies of the early 1900s. These marks had that same distinctive pattern, the irregular borders, the variation in pigmentation, the way healed burn tissue looked different from surrounding skin. But this was an infant, perhaps 6 to 8 months old. How would a baby acquire such extensive scarring? And why would the parents dress the child so carefully to conceal it while still choosing to have a photograph taken? The time period was significant. In 1903, photography was expensive and usually reserved for important occasions: weddings, christenings, commemorations of significant life events. Families didn't casually take photographs. Each image required planning, preparation, and financial investment. So why would this family choose to document themselves with a baby whose injuries they were clearly trying to hide? Emily pulled up her database of Boston area historical records and began searching for the Morrison family. The estate sale documentation had listed the original owner as Morrison family, Salem, Massachusetts, circa 1903. But that was all the information she had. Salem was a small city about 16 miles north of Boston, known for its witch trial history, but also as a prosperous maritime community in the early 1900s. She started with city directories from the period. Salem had several Morrison families listed in the 1903 directory, but without first names or specific addresses from the photograph's documentation, she couldn't narrow it down immediately. She made a list of all the Morrisons in Salem during that time period. There were 7 families with that surname. Next, she searched through digitized newspaper archives from Salem in 1902 and 1903, looking for any mentions of the Morrison families, particularly anything involving children or infants. Local newspapers from that era typically covered births, deaths, marriages, and social events in detail. After an hour of searching, she found a small notice in the Salem Evening News from November 1902. Fire at Mercy Orphanage claims 3 lives, several children injured. Emily's breath caught as she read the article. The Mercy Orphanage, located on Essex Street in Salem, had caught fire on the evening of November 15, 1902. The fire had started in the kitchen and spread rapidly through the wooden building. 3 children had died in the blaze, and several others had been injured, some severely. The article listed the names of the deceased children, but mentioned that several of the injured children were too young to have known names on record. Emily sat back, her mind racing. November 1902. The photograph was dated March 1903, just 4 months after the orphanage fire. Could the baby in the photograph have been one of the children injured in that fire? Emily continued reading through the newspaper archives, finding several follow-up articles about the orphanage fire. The coverage detailed the community's response, fundraising efforts to rebuild the orphanage, investigations into the cause of the fire, and updates on the injured children's conditions. One article from December 1902 mentioned that several of the burned children were being cared for in temporary foster situations while the orphanage was rebuilt, but there was nothing specific about adoptions. Nothing about families taking in the injured children permanently. Emily knew she needed more information. She pulled out her phone and called her colleague, James, a genealogist who specialized in New England family histories. He had access to adoption records, birth certificates, and church documents that weren't available in the public digital archives. "James, it's Emily. I need your help with something unusual," she said when he answered. "How unusual?" James asked. She could hear the interest in his voice. He loved historical mysteries as much as she did. "I'm looking at a photograph from 1903 of a family in Salem. A couple with an infant. The baby has what appear to be burn scars, and I think the child might have been rescued from the Mercy Orphanage fire in November 1902. There was a pause. "The orphanage fire? I remember reading about that. Terrible tragedy. But Emily, adoption records from that period are sealed, and even if they weren't, adoptions from orphanages were often informal, sometimes not documented at all." "I know," Emily said. "But there has to be something. Church records, baptismal certificates, census data, something that might show a family suddenly having a child they hadn't had before." James was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Let me see what I can find. What's the family name?" Morrison, in Salem, 1903. I don't have first names yet, but I'm working on narrowing down which Morrison family from the city directory. Give me a couple of days, James said. I'll search through church records and see if any of the Salem Morrison families had a baptism or christening recorded in early 1903. That christening gown in the photograph suggests a religious ceremony, so there should be a record somewhere. Emily thanked him and hung up. She turned back to her computer and continued examining the photograph, this time focusing on the background details. The living room where the family posed was well appointed, but not ostentatious. The furniture was quality, but not luxurious. The books on the shelf, the wallpaper, the framed pictures on the walls, all suggested a middle-class family of comfortable means, but not great wealth. She zoomed in on a framed photograph visible on a side table in the background. It showed a young couple, likely the same parents in their wedding photograph, posed formally in what appeared to be a studio setting. This suggested the family valued photography and documentation, which made the home portrait even more significant. 2 days later, James called with information that would break the case wide open. Emily, I found them, the Morrison family, and you were right. There's something extraordinary here. Emily grabbed her notebook, her heart racing. Tell me everything. The family is William and Catherine Morrison. William was a clerk at a shipping company. Catherine was a school teacher before marriage. They appear in the 1900 census as a married couple with no children. Then, in the 1910 census, they have a daughter named Grace, listed as age 7, which would mean she was born around 1903. But no birth record? Emily asked. No official birth record in Salem or the surrounding areas, James confirmed. But here's what I found. Saint. Mary's Church in Salem has a baptismal record for Grace Catherine Morrison, baptized on March 22, 1903. The record lists William and Catherine as parents, but there's a notation in the margin that I've never seen before. It says, child received into family by providence, baptized in thanksgiving. Emily felt chills run down her spine. Received into family by providence. That's a euphemism for adoption, isn't it? It appears so, but there's more. I found newspaper articles from February 1903 about the orphanage situation. After the fire, several children remained in the temporary hospital because of their injuries. The community was raising money, not just to rebuild the orphanage, but to provide medical care for the burned children. One article specifically mentions that several Salem families have opened their hearts and homes to the injured innocents, providing care and love during their recovery. Emily was writing frantically. So the Morrisons took in one of the injured children from the orphanage fire. It looks that way. And if the baptism was on March 22nd, and the photograph is dated March 1903, it's possible the photograph was taken right around the time of the baptism, commemorating the child's official welcome into the family and into the church. Emily looked at the photograph on her screen, seeing it with new understanding. This wasn't just a family portrait. This was documentation of an adoption, a rescue, a choice to love a child that others might have considered damaged or undesirable. In 1903, when social stigma around adoption was intense and children from orphanages were often viewed with suspicion, this family had chosen to take in an injured infant and raise her as their own. James, can you find anything else about Grace Morrison? What happened to her? Did she survive childhood? I'm already looking, James said. Give me another day or two. While James researched Grace's later life, Emily continued examining the photograph and gathering context about adoption and orphanages in early 1900s Massachusetts. What she learned painted a complex picture of the social attitudes the Morrison family would have faced. In 1903, adoption was not the celebrated act it would become in later decades. Orphanages were viewed with suspicion, and children from them were often considered to carry bad blood or inherited moral failings. The prevailing social theories of the time held that poverty, criminality, and other social problems were hereditary, passed down through families regardless of environment or upbringing. Families who adopted, especially from orphanages, rather than through private arrangements, often faced social stigma. They were sometimes accused of being unable to have real children or of taking in orphans for cheap labor rather than genuine care. And adopting a visibly scarred or disabled child would have been even more unusual. Such children were often considered unadoptable, destined to spend their lives in institutions. Yet the Morrison family had chosen differently. They had taken in an infant so severely burned that the scars would be visible for life, dressed her in an expensive christening gown, baptized her in their church, and commissioned a photograph to document their family. The care with which the gown was arranged to minimize the visibility of the scars suggested they were protecting Grace from judgment while still proudly claiming her as their daughter. Emily found more articles about the Mercy Orphanage fire, including testimony from the investigation. The fire had started around 8 in the evening when most of the children were in the dormitories preparing for bed. The older children had been able to escape, and several staff members had risked their lives to rescue the younger ones. But the nursery, where the infants were kept, had been on the second floor, and by the time rescuers reached it, the smoke was overwhelming. One article described the rescues in harrowing detail. 3 infants were pulled from the flames by brave citizens who climbed ladders to the second-floor windows. Though burned and barely breathing, the babes survived through God's mercy and the quick action of Dr. Patterson, who treated their injuries throughout the night. 3 infants rescued from the nursery. Emily wondered if Grace had been one of those 3. James called the next afternoon with news. I found Grace Morrison in the 1920 census. She was 17 years old, living with William and Catherine in Salem, working as a clerk in her father's office. She's listed as their daughter, no indication of adoption. Did you find anything else? Marriage record? Death certificate? Better, James said, and Emily could hear the smile in his voice. I found her obituary. Grace Morrison married in 1925 to a man named Robert Hughes. She died in 1987 at age 84 in Portland, Maine. The obituary is quite detailed. She had 3 children, worked as a teacher like her mother, was active in her church and community. And Emily, the obituary mentions that she was a survivor of the Mercy Orphanage fire, and that she dedicated much of her life to supporting children in foster care and adoption services. Emily's hands trembled as she read the obituary James had sent. The photograph of Grace from the obituary showed an elderly woman with white hair and gentle eyes smiling at the camera. Even in old age, Emily could see the resemblance to the baby in the 1903 photograph, the same round face, the same gentle expression. But it was the text of the obituary that brought tears to Emily's eyes. Grace Morrison Hughes often spoke of her gratitude to William and Catherine Morrison, who rescued her from the orphanage fire in 1902 when she was just 4 months old and raised her as their own daughter despite the extensive burns she carried for life. She said their love taught her that family is not defined by blood but by choice and commitment. This belief guided her 50-year career in social work, where she advocated tirelessly for children in foster care and for families willing to adopt children with special needs. Emily sat back, overwhelmed by the weight of this discovery. The baby in the photograph, the infant with burn scars that had first caught her attention, had lived a full, meaningful life. She had survived the trauma of the fire, the challenges of visible scarring in an era when such things were often hidden away, and had turned her experience into a lifetime of service to other children in similar situations. But Emily needed to know more. The obituary mentioned 3 children. Were any of Grace's descendants still alive? Did they know the full story of their grandmother's rescue and adoption? She searched online for the names mentioned in the obituary. Grace's children were listed as Patricia Hughes, Michael Hughes, and Elizabeth. After several hours of searching through social media and public records, Emily found a Patricia Anderson in Portland who appeared to be the right age to be Grace's daughter. Emily composed an email carefully, explaining who she was, what she had found, and asking if Patricia would be willing to speak with her about the photograph and her mother's story. She sent it with a mixture of hope and nervousness. The reply came the next morning. Dr. Chen, I am Patricia Anderson, Grace's daughter. I am astounded and moved that you found this photograph. My mother spoke often of her adoption, but said there were no photographs from that time. I would very much like to speak with you. Can we arrange a video call? 2 days later, Emily sat in her office as Patricia's face appeared on her screen. She was a woman in her late 60s with her mother's gentle features, her eyes bright with emotion. My mother told us she was adopted, but I never saw any documentation, Patricia said. She said the Morrisons were her real parents in every way that mattered. She showed us her scars. They covered much of her arms and parts of her torso, and told us they were from the orphanage fire. But we never had proof, never had photographs from before her teenage years. Emily shared her screen, showing Patricia the 1903 family portrait. Patricia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. That's her. That's my mother as a baby, and those are William and Catherine, my grandparents. Patricia composed herself, wiping tears from her eyes. I'm sorry, it's just seeing her like this, seeing them. My mother talked about them with such love, but I never had an image in my mind of what they looked like when they were young, when they took her in. Emily zoomed in on the baby's visible scars. Your mother's burns were extensive. This photograph shows the family trying to conceal them with the gown's positioning, but they're still visible. In 1903, adopting a visibly scarred infant would have been extraordinary. Patricia nodded. My mother said people used to stare at her scars when she was growing up. This was before modern burn treatment, before skin grafts. The scars were permanent and obvious. She said her parents, William and Catherine, always treated her burns matter-of-factly. They never made her feel ashamed or tried to hide her away. They just loved her. The photograph suggests they were protective, Emily observed. The careful arrangement of the gown, the formal pose, but also the decision to take a photograph at all to document their family. My mother said the photograph was taken for the baptism, Patricia explained. In the Catholic tradition, baptism is when a child becomes part of the church family. William and Catherine wanted to mark that moment, Grace officially becoming their daughter, both legally through adoption and spiritually through baptism. Emily showed Patricia the other details she'd discovered: the church records, the newspaper articles about the fire, the census data showing the family over the decades. Patricia listened intently, occasionally asking questions, often wiping away tears. "There's something else I need to tell you," Patricia said when Emily had finished. "Something my mother left for her grandchildren. When she died in 1987, we found a sealed envelope addressed to my family, to be opened after my death. Inside was a letter she'd written describing her life, including details about the adoption that she'd never shared while alive." Patricia pulled out her phone and sent Emily a scanned copy of the letter. "I'm going to read part of it to you," she said. "The part about William and Catherine and why they chose to adopt her." She began reading in a voice thick with emotion. "I learned when I was older that William and Catherine had lost a baby daughter in 1901, just months before the orphanage fire. Their daughter, also named Grace, had died of influenza at 6 months old. When they heard about the fire and the injured babies, Catherine told William she felt called to help. They went to the hospital where the burned infants were being treated, intending to donate money or supplies. But when Catherine saw me, tiny, burned, crying in pain, she knew she was meant to be my mother. William said later that he saw his lost daughter in my eyes, that he believed God had brought me to them to heal both their hearts and mine." Patricia continued reading from her mother's letter. "They took me home in December 1902, when I was barely strong enough to leave the hospital. The doctor said I might not survive, that the burns were too severe, the damage too extensive. But Catherine nursed me day and night. She changed my bandages, sang to me when I cried from pain, held me when the nightmares came. William built a special cradle that wouldn't press against my burns. They spent money they didn't have on medical care, on special ointments, on anything that might help me heal. By March 1903, I was healthy enough to be baptized. They wanted the photograph to send to Catherine's family in Ireland, to show them their new granddaughter, to prove that love could heal even the deepest wounds." Emily felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Your mother's letter is extraordinary. It fills in all the gaps in the historical record." "She wanted us to know," Patricia said, "that family isn't about blood or perfection. It's about choice and commitment. She said William and Catherine chose her when she was unwanted and damaged, and that choice shaped everything about who she became. She spent her life trying to help other children find families who would choose them the same way." Patricia then shared something else, photographs of Grace throughout her life. As a young woman in the 1920s, her scars still visible on her arms, but her smile confident and bright. As a bride in 1925, wearing a long-sleeved wedding dress but holding her bouquet proudly. As a middle-aged woman in the 1950s, surrounded by foster children she and her husband had taken in over the years. As an elderly woman in the 1980s, holding a great-grandchild with the same gentle expression visible in the 1903 baby photograph. "She never hid her scars," Patricia explained. "She said they were part of her story, part of what made her who she was. When children asked about them, she told them about the fire, about being rescued, about finding a family who loved her. She turned her scars into a teaching tool about resilience and acceptance." Emily asked if Patricia would be willing to have the 1903 photograph and Grace's story featured in an exhibition about adoption and family in early 20th century America. Patricia agreed immediately. "My mother's story deserves to be told. So does William and Catherine's courage in adopting her when so few would have." Over the next several months, Emily worked on the exhibition, gathering documents, photographs, and contextual information about adoption practices, orphanage fires, and attitudes towards scarred or disabled children in the early 1900s. She tracked down records of the other 2 infants rescued from the Mercy Orphanage fire. Both had also survived and been adopted by Salem families, though their stories were less thoroughly documented than Grace's. The exhibition opened to significant attention. Visitors were moved by the 1903 photograph, by the visible scars on baby Grace's arms, by the protective way Catherine held her daughter, by the story of a family choosing love over social conformity. 8 months after discovering the photograph, Emily stood in the exhibition hall of the Boston Historical Society, watching visitors examine the 1903 family portrait that had started everything. The exhibition, titled "Chosen: Stories of Adoption and Family in Early America," had drawn crowds since opening. But today was special. Patricia and her family had traveled from Maine for the dedication ceremony. The photograph was displayed in a prominent position, carefully lit to show every detail. Beside it hung the enlarged sections showing baby Grace's scars, alongside text explaining the Mercy Orphanage fire, the social stigma of adoption in 1903, and the Morrison family's courage in choosing to love a child others might have rejected. Grace's later photographs were displayed chronologically, showing her life from infancy through old age, documenting not just her survival, but her thriving. Patricia stood with her own children and grandchildren, several of whom bore striking resemblances to Grace and to the Morrisons. One of Patricia's granddaughters, a college student studying social work, stood transfixed before the original 1903 photograph. I can see the scars now that I know to look for them, she said softly. But mostly I see how carefully they're holding her, how much they loved her. A reporter from the Boston Globe approached Emily, asking the question she'd been asked countless times since the exhibition opened. Dr. Chen, what do you think is the most important lesson from this photograph in Grace's story? Emily looked at the image. William standing protective and proud, Catherine cradling baby Grace with infinite tenderness, the infant looking toward the camera with calm trust. She thought about Grace's letter describing how William and Catherine had saved her life through sheer determination and love. She thought about Grace's own lifetime of work helping other children find families. I think, Emily said carefully, it reminds us that love is a choice, and that choosing to love, especially when it's difficult, when society judges you, when the child is considered damaged or undesirable, is one of the most powerful acts of courage humans are capable of. In 1903, William and Catherine Morrison could have simply donated money to the orphanage fund and gone on with their lives. Instead, they chose to take in a severely burned infant, to provide years of painful medical care, to face social stigma, to love her as their own. That choice changed Grace's life, but it also changed countless other lives. All the children Grace helped throughout her career, all the families she encouraged to adopt, all the people who learned from her example that scars don't define worth. The reporter scribbled notes, then asked, "And what about the scars visible in the photograph? Why do you think the Morrisons dressed Grace carefully to minimize them but still took the photograph?" Emily had thought about this question extensively. I think they were protecting her while also claiming her. The careful arrangement of the gown shows they understood the world would judge her for those scars, and they wanted to shield her from that judgment. But by taking the photograph at all, by documenting their family, by sending it to relatives as proof of their new daughter, they were also declaring that Grace was theirs, scars and all. It's a balance, protecting her vulnerability while celebrating her place in their family. Patricia joined them, adding her own perspective. My mother used to say that William and Catherine taught her that scars tell stories of survival, not shame. They never pretended the burns didn't exist, but they also never let the burns define who she was. The photograph captures that perfectly. The scars are there, visible if you look closely, but they're not the focus. The focus is the family, the love, the connection. As the afternoon wore on, Emily watched visitors engage with the exhibition. Many stopped longest at Grace's letter, reading her words about choice and commitment. Others studied the timeline of her life, noting her transition from rescued infant to devoted mother and social worker. Several visitors were themselves adoptive parents or adopted children, and they shared their own stories of finding family through choice rather than biology. One elderly woman approached Emily with tears in her eyes. "I was adopted in 1945, she said. "From an orphanage, like Grace. My adoptive parents are gone now, but seeing this photograph, reading about William and Catherine, it reminds me of them, of how they chose me when I felt unchosen. Thank you for telling this story." Emily felt the weight of that gratitude, understanding that Grace's story resonated because it touched something universal, the human need to belong, to be chosen, to be loved despite our scars and imperfections. As the exhibition hall began to empty for the evening, Patricia approached Emily one final time. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing what others might have missed in that photograph, for caring enough to investigate, for giving my mother's story the recognition it deserves." Emily looked back at the 1903 photograph one more time. William and Catherine Morrison gazed out across 120 years, their protective stance around baby Grace unchanged by time. The scars that had first caught Emily's attention were still visible, still part of the story, but no longer the whole story. What remained, preserved in silver and light, was evidence of something far more powerful than tragedy. Evidence of healing, of family, of the transformative power of choosing to love. Baby Grace had been rescued from fire and given a life full of purpose and meaning. William and Catherine had transformed their grief into generosity, their loss into legacy. The photograph was more than historical documentation. It was proof that even in 1903, even in a society that stigmatized adoption and judged visible difference, individuals could choose courage over conformity, love over fear, and family over everything that tried to divide them. That choice, made by the Morrisons in 1902 when they took in a burned infant no one else wanted, had echoed through 5 generations and touched countless lives. And now their story would continue to inspire others who faced the choice to love despite difficulty, to choose family despite imperfection, to see beyond scars to the precious life beneath.